So for this next section on Unit 6, we're going to be looking at the mechanisms behind evolution and defining what species are and how species become more species. In this first video of the two, we're going to focus on the mechanisms, and then we'll focus on speciation in a separate video after this. So why do we even care in the first place? When we look at the ways that evolution works and the ways that evolution can kind of manifest, this really gives us a deeper understanding of the origins and how organisms continue to evolve. So it allows us to kind of take a snapshot of the past while also looking forward into the future. Now, a little bit of background information, a little bit of review before we go too far in. We need to remember that alleles are the variations of the same gene found in a population, and that every individual is going to have two alleles, one allele for the gene from each parent. And it's important for us to remember, like we talked about in the last set of videos, is that evolution doesn't involve changing genetics and it doesn't involve changing individuals. We're looking at populations when we're looking at evolution. So instead, we're looking at the proportions of alleles within a population changing over time. So if we gather about, let's say 10 individuals make up a population, that means there's 20 alleles between all 10 people. We're looking at the proportion of those alleles in that group. So let's say that 10 of the alleles are dominant and 10 are recessive. And over time, as that population reproduces and dies off as we go through the generations, we might see that 10 dominant, 10 recessive allele proportion change to a 15 dominant and 5 recessive allele proportion. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at evolution. So anytime that allele frequency, which is what I just kind of talked about, anytime that proportion, that allele frequency changes between the generations, that means evolution has occurred. So when we are looking at evolution, it doesn't have to be some massive major change. Evolution can happen on a micro scale and a macro scale. So micro scale would be maybe the changes that occur after a few generations, and the macro scale, that would be like the millennia, right? Thousands and thousands, if not millions of years. Now, we do want to be careful when we are talking about dominant and recessive alleles. Remember that dominant and recessive has to do with the masking ability, not the commonality of the allele. So you can have a recessive allele that's really, really common and a dominant allele that's really, really rare. A good example for that is the dominant allele that causes Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a dominant condition, so if you have the dominant allele, you have Huntington's, but you very rarely see Huntington's in people, mainly because it's horrific, and also because it's not a common allele to find. We can also look at blood type in the United States. The most common blood type is O, which is homozygous recessive. That means there has to be a lot of recessive alleles in the population to see so many homozygous recessive individuals. So just some background information, things to get us thinking before we go any further in with evolution. Now, the mother or father, whichever gender you'd like to choose, the mother of all evolution or all change is mutation. So we have to have some sort of mutation happen in order to see any sort of differences down the line. So evolution by mutation, this is because the DNA has somehow been altered, and that alteration has been passed from the parent to their offspring. But remember that the mutation has to be found in the gametes in order to be passed on. So for example, if I go and I have offspring, like if I have a kid, and then later on after I've had my kid, I go out and get exposed to the sun and I get skin cancer, there's mutations there, but the mutation has been found in my skin, not my gametes, and I've already had my offspring. So it has to be a mutation found in the gametes in order for it to pass on. If it's something like in your liver or your skin or something like that, it won't be passed down. Mutations can happen randomly. It is something that sometimes the mechanisms that replicate DNA, sometimes they just make mistakes, just like if you would accidentally make a typo in a paper you were writing and you didn't catch it. Same kind of thing can happen with our cells. But there's also things in the environment that can cause mutations to pop up more frequently. Things like radiation, certain chemicals, things like carcinogens. So UV light, UV radiation is a really common cause that causes many skin cancers. And so that's why we are so adamant about people wearing sunscreen all year round. Despite knowing what causes mutations, the cell types that will be affected and the location of mutations cannot be predicted. So despite knowing what can cause mutations, which cell type will be affected, and the location of the mutations, we cannot necessarily predict. We do see a lot of correlations. So like if you are a smoker, you're more likely to get something like lung cancer. If you go tanning, you're more likely to get skin cancer, but we can't tell you exactly where in the skin or the lungs or which type of cell found in either organ is going to be affected. So it's not like we can pinpoint it before it starts. We just have like these generalities that we know. And that's only for the environmental factors that have a strong link. In terms of random mutations, there is literally no way of knowing. We also don't know what the effects of the mutation could be because some mutations are completely neutral. They do absolutely nothing. Some are going to be beneficial. Some might lead to a brand new trait we've never seen before. And others can be totally harmful, even fatal. So mutations can really vary in terms of what they can do for an organism, right? We do need mutations to lead to new changes, because that's how we get, that's how blue eyes came to be, that's how different skin colors came to be, that's how a lot of the different traits we've seen have come to be. But behind the beneficial traits, there was a lot of individuals who either had harmless traits that did nothing, or who died or didn't have as many offspring because their mutations were harmful. Now, it's important to think when we're thinking about mutations, we're looking at a species. We want to take a step back and escape from the human-centric mindset, because we're looking at who's experiencing the mutation. Is it helpful for them? Is it harmless for them? Is it harmful for them? So we don't want to necessarily apply this strictly to humans. This applies across the board. And when we're talking about the effects of mutation, we're talking about the effects for the individual with the mutation, regardless of species, right? And that includes even if it's bad for us. So you think like if you think about like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, that ability to survive antibiotics is beneficial for the bacteria. It's harmful for us as people, but it's great for the bacteria. So we want to make sure we take the mindset of the species, like take the perspective of the species we're looking at. Now, mutation is just one of many mechanisms of evolution. This is a snapshot. We have mutation, right, which is again the kind of the starting point for all change to happen. We have genetic drift. This is a random change in allele frequencies. It has nothing to do with reproductive success, and we'll talk about a couple examples of that. Migration, this is a change in allele frequencies because individuals are moving in or moving out. And natural selection, which is one we're really going to talk about. This is the one that Charles Darwin proposed, if you remember from the last few videos. So natural selection we're going to really kind of hammer in on. There are some other mechanisms of evolution, including things like artificial selection, which would be human-based, like breeding and whatnot, that we influence, right? We're influencing the change. So like I said, mutation is the mother of all change. It is the ultimate source of genetic variation in a population because it's creating alleles that have never been seen before. Everything else that we're going to talk about after this is just a recombination of the alleles already in existence. But mutation gives us brand new things. It's the creative one, basically. And if the allele is not harmful, it can be passed down to the offspring. Despite its importance, most mutations basically do nothing on an organism's fitness. If you remember looking at the codon chart, or if you go and you look at a codon chart, you will see that many codons will give you the same amino acid if you're building a protein. And so if you change, let's say CCU and CCA give you the same amino acid and you mutate from CCC to CCU, it doesn't really matter that the mutation even happened, because the amino acid at the end is the same. It has no effect on the actual function of that organism. Now, we've been talking about fitness, or kind of mentioning fitness a little bit here and there, and we want to make sure that we know that evolutionary fitness is telling us how well an organism survives in its current environment. It's not about bigger, faster, stronger, right? So we can take that idea, toss it out. Possibly being faster could be a better fit. Maybe being stronger could be a better fit, but also being slower could be a better fit, depending on the environment we're in. So think of it again, it's not fitness like you go to the gym and you work on your fitness. It's fit like, how well do your clothes fit you? If your size changes, if you gain or lose weight and your clothes don't fit right anymore, then you have to go to a different size for a better fit. So there's no rule saying that large is better than small or small is better than medium. There's no rules like that in terms of clothing. They're simply sizes. And it's up to you to find the clothes and the size for you that fits you best. And so that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at evolutionary fitness. Now, in order for a mutation to successfully pass on, it has to happen in a gamete cell, because those are the cells that are going to become the offspring, so the sperm, the eggs. And it has to happen in a gene. There's a lot of DNA, especially if we do look at humans. There's a lot of DNA that's not part of a gene, and so it does not code for anything. And if it's not coding for anything, it might not really even matter. So we have to have a mutation happen in a gamete. It has to happen not just within a gamete, but within a gene found in that gamete, and it has to not be harmful. If it's harmful, then it's going to die out pretty quickly. It's going to disappear, right? Or at least be very infrequent for the most part. So it can't be harmful to the organism themselves, the gamete, or the offspring, right? Because if it hurts the organism, then that organism could die. If it hurts the gamete, then the organism might be sterile, right? They might not be able to reproduce. And if it hurts the offspring, well, then it didn't matter that the organism had any offspring, because the offspring did not survive and reproduce themselves. All right, so we looked at mutation, and we do have mechanisms to reduce the chances of mutations. We have the ability to proofread, just like you have the ability to proofread your papers. You can find most of the mistakes. It's when that one slips past you that the mutation becomes set in stone. And so we look at this one, we look at the normal phenotype for cat ears, and we see they're just like the little normal cat ears, but there is a mutation in one of those proteins that gives you what we call the American curl cat breed, where the ears slightly curl outward, which in this case doesn't really do anything for these cats, right, for these house cats. Another way that we can see changes in a population is through genetic drift. And so if we look at genetic drift, right, this is where basically reproductive success has nothing to do with it. So let's say we're looking at fur color. We have white fur, we have no white fur, so basically the kind of tuxedo looking cat versus solid. Neither of these colors have anything to do with reproductive success, because these cats are not using color as any sort of like mating choice or mating basis. So cats are not like looking at the orange and white cat saying, oh wow, you're more attractive than just the orange cat. They're not thinking that. So in this case, we see that we can have a shift in the alleles just because random chance, who ended up mating with who, and we see that the solid cats are becoming more common, right? But again, the coloring had nothing to do with that. It just was an allele frequency shift due to chance. So genetic drift, like I said, is random. It is a random change. It's due to chance. And it's more apparent in small populations. So small populations are more susceptible to larger kind of allele frequency shifts, simply because each allele kind of holds more weight since there's so few alleles in the entire population. So if we looked at a population of 10 individuals, which would only have 20 alleles, versus 100 individuals that would have 200 alleles, even one, the change to go towards like one allele or the other, a small change is going to look really, really big in the small population. So let's say we add 2 more dominance alleles in the small population versus 2 in the large. The 2 in the small population is going to appear percentage-wise much larger. Whereas in the large population, those 2 extra dominant alleles kind of drowns out in the rest of the pool. Think of it like trying to find someone in a crowd. If you're trying to make your way through a small crowd, it's pretty easy, but if you're trying to make your way through a large crowd, there's a lot more going on around you, and you kind of get lost in the sea of people. One of the potential consequences of genetic drift is what we call allele fixation. And this is where basically one allele becomes 100% and the other alleles all disappear. Once they're gone, once those alleles are gone, they're gone, right? You would have to have a mutation somehow pop up with the exact same allele, the exact same trait, in order to ever see it again. And so we do have, in these small populations especially, the potential of losing some of that diversity. So basically with that population, until a mutation happens, there's no variability, there's no variation for that gene. And we'll talk a little bit more of how that can be damaging, of why we need the variation we see, why we need the diversity we see, but we'll hold off on that for just a little bit. And there's a couple different versions of genetic drift. One is the founder effect, and this is basically where a small group of individuals leave the main population and found a new population. So usually the example is a large population of some animal found on like a mainland, and then a few individuals from the mainland move to a new island off the mainland and establish a new population on the island. And so we look at like this source population, we see that most of them are this green and there's a few that are teal. And let's say this represents everyone on the mainland, and this chunk right here is coming from the mainland and moving to an island. If they move to an island, they're going to take their alleles with them and those allele frequencies. And so if you happen to have a large, let's say this large green population, a very little teal population, but a good chunk of your teal population becomes the founders for this new island, you end up seeing a shift in the allele frequencies. Suddenly that teal allele becomes way more common simply because we happen to have more teal individuals come from the mainland. So we see that the proportions change in the island because the new proportions are based off of the individuals who came from the mainland to the island, not the entire mainland itself. Another example is the bottleneck effect. And so the bottleneck effect is due to some sort of catastrophe, famine, disease, fire, flood, some sort of rapid environmental change, something that really big happens that causes most of a population to die. And that those deaths are random. There's no traits that really could protect those individuals. So for example, if a fire comes through, like a forest fire burns through and rages through an area, pretty much if you survived it, you got lucky, right? Most of the plants and animals died off because they were burned, or like if a flood came through, they were drowned. And so it was really just like you happened to be in the right place at the right time in order to survive it. So most of our population is killed off. Here's our source population we originally had. We see that we had about like almost half blue, about a quarter green, and then smaller fractions of yellow and purple. Most of our population is killed off by some sort of massive change, and we see that probably about 80% of our population was killed. And so the new population that establishes after that catastrophic event can only express the alleles that are left. And so in this case, we have a shift in blue and green. We see blue took over more, green was very little, and that purple and yellow were totally lost. Because again, the new population can only be based off of the survivors who survived at random, not any sort of particular trait or anything. There's nothing special that kept them safe. And we see that with the bottleneck effect, we tend to lose diversity, and we tend to lose the more rare alleles. So like blue and green, which were fairly common, making up about 75% of the population, were safe, but the purple and the yellow that made up only about a quarter completely disappeared, simply because there were already so few individuals who had those alleles. So founders population, basically, we're saying that the allele frequencies they're probably going to be different from the original population because we're basing the allele frequencies on the new area based off of the founders who traveled there. And so the founding population will give rise to all the new members, and so different alleles may dominate when they didn't dominate on the mainland. And then the bottleneck effect, again, we're looking at catastrophe. If we look at possible causes, fire, flood, famine, earthquakes, any sort of major weather change, right? There's a lot of things that could cause bottleneck effect. Basically something that's fast and something that's catastrophic, so that most of a population dies from it. Anyone who survives, the remaining members of the population, will probably have a different allele frequency from the original. And just like the founder effect, we see that the variation tends to reduce down, and that the rare alleles that we saw in the larger original population tend to have a chance at disappearing. And again, once the allele is gone, it's gone. The only way you're going to add more alleles is if you have new mutations pop up.